Senators Nolan, Watt, Baker, Wallace, Joyal, and Carignan have questions for Mr. Jones.
I read we received that answer in the text, and a lot of the answers were already in your text. So I don't know who's next, but I'm ready to pass to my colleagues. You are?
Okay.
Well, that's what happens when somebody takes the trouble to produce a 40-page brief.
That's it. Everything is in
For
it.
which we are very grateful, may I say.
35 in English.
Okay, Senator Watt, back to your question.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And again, once again, I'm going to be repeating the same questions that I have put forward. And I believe you were here at the time when the previous witnesses were here. In relation to the longer sentence and the being refused on bail. So if you could explain that to me, and I would appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Senator Watt, this is a very important question. I'm going to give you a very brief answer and offer to follow up with a considerably longer answer because there have been books written on this topic. It boils down to this. There are historical and political reasons for why Aboriginal offenders are treated differently. And they amount to structural causes for discrimination. They begin at the very beginning with a higher incidence of things like fetal alcohol effect, untreated trauma, undiagnosed learning disabilities, inadequate schooling, inadequate nutrition, inadequate parenting. This is a characteristic that is not unique to Aboriginal populations, but generalized across poor and marginalized populations everywhere in the world. And in this country, the majority of poor and marginalized populations are Aboriginal, and in the inner cities they are black, Jamaican, and so forth. Okay? So what happens is they come into contact with the criminal justice system, and very often, despite the best efforts of the officers who first engage with them, they collide again and again and again with the criminal justice system, and then perhaps they are detained because the behavior tends to escalate, particularly in regard to young boys, as they mature into their high risk-taking years, say between the ages of 16 and 22, 23, 24. They begin to consume alcohol, they begin to experiment with drugs, but we know that their executive functions, i.e. the structure of their brain, is not fully developed, so they may be more reckless. I mean, this is why young men are drafted into military organizations. And in the context of Aboriginal populations, it's no different. But they collide with the justice system more often because, and this is very important, they are the low-hanging fruit. They are easier. That means they're easier to arrest, easier to prosecute, easier to incarcerate. And because of the combination of factors relating to their upbringing and social circumstances, they are less able to advocate for themselves. So, for example, where somebody from my social class would be able to get bail because my mom or dad would be able to put up the money for me, I wouldn't be detained.
That's one, yeah.
An Aboriginal young person from northern Saskatchewan or even farther north is less able, doesn't have the resources to do that. So, and the evidence shows that if they're detained, they're more likely to be convicted. That's not, I don't want to point the finger at any one individual, but it's the nature of the structure of historical and political discrimination against minority communities in Canada. And then once they're incarcerated, again, they are less able to advocate for themselves. And the system, not the individuals in the system, but the system itself tends to relegate them to the margins. So that even where and I spend a lot of time with officials in the correctional service, and I really believe that they are trying to produce the very best correctional outcomes they can. But they are under-resourced, they are overworked, they have more people than they can manage, they can't staff up to the level necessary to treat the people. You heard about the long waiting lists. And so it concatenates one into another to produce this outcome that is really inequitable, unjust, and about to get a lot worse as this package of criminal justice legislation rolls through and becomes law. And that is why it is so important that I go on the historical record to say this criminal justice legislation package is a disaster for everyone, but most particularly for people who are already systematically discriminated against. That's the short answer.
Just a very short one. Hopefully it's a short one. I think you are giving me a long list of the reasons why that they are being treated differently. But that has still not answered my question. Why are they staying in a longer period?
Oh, okay. All right. Well, now we come back to the issue of self-advocacy. Okay? My organization, as you know, represents offenders across the system, and we go in and prepare offenders for their release date, prepare them for the parole dates. But my organization is operating at the absolute limits of its capacity. I'll tell you what happens to us, to John Howard workers. When particularly good John Howard workers get up to the level where they're really being effective, they are poached by the parole board or by CSC. And yes, some of them will continue to advocate for early release of prisoners, and others will be diverted into programming or various other tasks, and the whole system is operating at the very limits of its capacity. And Aboriginal offenders are not at the gate, as it were, demanding to see their institutional parole officer, demanding to have access to their programs, because they have not developed a culture of self-advocacy. Now, that's why so few wealthy white kids go to jail, because they have a culture of advocating for themselves. And Aboriginal and poor populations do not.
So in other words, they don't belong there. And if they don't belong there, and if they cannot be treated the same way on the equality basis, where do we go?
Senator, I believe, I think probably most of you understand this now, that we have created criminality in our society through the mechanism of drug prohibition. And many of the young persons who will be caught up in this legislation will be guilty of nothing more than self-administering a currently illicit drug. That's a policy choice that everybody around this table has inherited from the 19th century, and it is a disaster. I was trying to think, as Madame Joncas was talking, that mandatory minimum sentences are the equivalent to putting new propellers on the Titanic.